2019. So I've had a very kind of linear and traditional trajectory within academia, so can speak to kind of the things that I also did a postdoc at Hopkins. So kind of what happens along the stages of academia and a kind of more traditional route. I am in a research intensive university and in College of Medicine, meaning that I do pretty much exclusively research and very little, if any, teaching. So.
Yeah, thank you, Zen. Jacob, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Jake. I just finished a PhD at Berkeley in stats this May. Before that, I did a Marshall Scholarship at Bristol and Oxford, where I studied math and physics. And before that, I was at University of Illinois, the Urbana-Champaign campus, where I studied bioengineering. Since finishing college, I've worked at startups, one for 7 years that was just sold a few months ago. And now I'm at a new one. And I might do a postdoc, I don't know. Right now I'm sort of trying to make my own one, doing some independent math research on something I've been wanting to work on for like 10 years while I worked for a stealth mode startup with some of the people I worked with before.
Yeah, thank you. Sam, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi everyone. I'm Sam. I'm a 2013 Goldwater Scholar. Did my undergrad at U Chicago. I did grad school at several different places. Oxford, Yale, back to U Chicago, then Columbia, where I received my PhD in chemistry. And I'm now doing a postdoc in mechanical engineering at University of Texas. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And Kelly, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi, my name's Keely. I'm a PhD student at Harvard studying immunology. I'm a first year right now. I graduated from UC Davis studying cell biology in 2022, and I was a 2021 Goldwater Scholar. And nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Yes, that leaves me. Hi everyone, I'm Teddy. I am currently, well, I should say I am 2021. I forget. Two cycles ago, Goldwater Scholar. And I'm currently a first year PhD student at MIT, where I just finished my undergraduate degree in chemistry and electrical engineering from UT Austin. Now my research is mostly focused on nanoscale fabrication. So whether that is nanoelectronics or photonic based materials such as Raman spectroscopy systems and that on and so forth. I also should mention I am the co-coordinator for the Goldwater Scholar community, who's the organization that helped put on this event. So you might have seen my name in the taglines and the emails I send out, or maybe not. But I'm glad to see you guys here, and I hope I could contribute something to this panel.
And I think that as I mentioned before, that because our audience also have a lot of students also just freshmen, and they maybe do not know much about the application process in general. Could anyone share about the general application process, so audience can have a big picture about the application process?
Sure. So just like a general overview of the components of an application.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say for STEM, at least in physical sciences, the major components are your letters recommendation from usually 3 recommenders. Your actual application itself will include a personal statement and a SOP, which sometimes is the same, sometimes not, depending on exactly which school you're applying to. I think was it Justin or Jake who was talking about how there was not a GRE post-COVID. You have to check every department, every school of the. Oh yeah, I should mention you should probably have made a list of the schools you're applying to, and then go and check through what their requirements are in terms of GRE, which is the standardized test. And then besides that, everyone has their own structured form that with probably supplemental essays embedded in there. So such things like diversity inclusion, or what your cultural background is, or like why you want to be grad school, with other specific questions that you can answer. But that really depends on which school and which discipline you're applying to. Am I missing anything?
No, I one thing I kind of joke about when you apply to grad school, one of the hardest parts is figuring out how to apply to grad school. Because every single website is different. Half the schools hide the thing behind some outdated website that was last updated in 2016, and it's unclear if it's the current instructions. So it does take some work to figure out the exact things that are needed. The things that Teddy brought up that included things like statement of purpose, cover letter, letters of rec are pretty uniform across universities. And of course, there's program specific information that you might need to give. If you do run into issues and trying to find how and where and when to apply, just keep on Googling down the train. Often departments will have a director of graduate studies or something to that effect, and they can be a good person to reach out to if you really truly can't figure out the application process. MIT's website is archaic. Pretty much everyone's is. And so it's often very difficult to find that info. GRE was brought up just briefly. So schools increasingly are removing the GRE as a requirement. It is going to vary program to program, and it's going to vary place to place, and it's probably going to vary for the next coming years, year to year. So some programs are reinstituting them, some are not. So be careful about looking for that. Some will have it as optional and not required. Some of it will have it as required. Some will have, we don't want to see the score at all. So important to look into.
And maybe just to add on that, I think at least pre-COVID, some fields, it was popular to require GRE subject tests. For example, physics used to almost universally require a physics GRE subject test. I think that's changing in recent years. So in addition to the GRE, you should check subject tests, and then check if sometimes it only matters for the application, but sometimes it matters if you want to be considered for like specific fellowships or financial aid. So check those out.
And what Teddy just brought up, the question about if GRE is optional, do you recommend submitting scores? This is a somewhat kind of, if they're good, sure. But one of the biggest reasons to take the GRE, even if it's not required, is some schools will have fellowships that open up once you reach a certain minimum score on the GRE. And that sometimes is why they're asking for them if they're optional. So for example, at Kentucky, they had a internal fellowship that if you had a 90th percentile or higher on one or more score, you were eligible to apply for that fellowship. And so that's one of the reasons that they can be there and still be optional.
That'd be great to know. Oh, and I think that like some students also wonder about how you obtain the funding or the fellowship to like pay for your PhD program. Yeah. Patrick, do you want to share about it?
Sorry, the question is just about where to look for fellowships and funding.
Oh yeah, and how did you obtain the funding and the fellowship for your PhD program?
So the program that I did was funded, meaning that you didn't have to apply for anything. You're set, you're going to get your stipend and everything. And then you just might have to teach some semesters. And honestly, that can be a joy. Sometimes it can be a lot of work, especially if you're the kind of person who wants to do a good job with everything you do. And that can take a lot of time away from research. But again, that's not a problem if you're working with an advisor who can cover your time with grant money, or if your department just doesn't have any teaching responsibilities. So that's something to look into when you're looking at programs. And for some areas, I know, it's pretty uncommon for people to have to teach. And so in that case, the only reason to get a fellowship is clout, extra pay, and then there's some additional benefits to that. So there are some big fellowships that a lot of people apply for, like the GRFP, NSEG, the DOE fellowship, Hertz. There are many others, Soros. I'm sure I'm missing tons of them. And there are online resources where you can find just huge lists of these fellowships. The good thing about these is that the effort scales well. If you write good materials, it's easy to apply to a lot of them. And if you've already applied for Goldwater, I'm sure that you have some good materials to start working off of.
So something that was brought up there, that if you come from a background that you don't have exposure to graduate programs and PhD programs, that's really important to keep in mind. Very rarely, if ever, and I may be misspeaking to some disciplines, but most disciplines, a PhD program is going to be fully funded, meaning you're not paying your tuition as a PhD student. Master programs are often different. Often you're paying for master's, PhD programs. In most cases, you're going to be receiving that tuition as a part of your service to the department and your admittance into the program, and some sort of stipend. And so when you're looking at programs, do keep that in mind. It can be and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, the stipends often aren't commensurate with what you're actually putting in, and it's an important kind of financial decision to go to grad school. Tuition is not necessarily in the case there. The GRFP came up. That's the NSF's program, National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program. That's a really good opportunity for I think pretty much everyone on this call, or the majority of folks on this call. It's a program you can apply to before you go to graduate school. At least in my case, I applied for it as a senior in undergrad, received it, and was able to cover my first 3 years of graduate school with a GRFP, which meant I didn't have that teaching responsibility, which, while later on I did some TAing, and it certainly is a really enriching experience. It was brought up by Jake that it's also very time intensive, so it can be a good way to relieve some of that tension. I'll drop in a link to the GRFP as one example that you certainly should look into. It's a surprisingly low level of effort for the amount of, it's a 3-year fellowship, fully funded, covers your tuition as well as the stipend that's very generous relative to most graduate stipends. So worth looking into. I will say, having now sat on the GRFP review panel a couple of times, it is a crapshoot. So don't be discouraged by feedback you get. You have to think of it this way. There are, unlike many like real grants, well, not real grants that you get long-term that are reviewed by people that know the research you're doing. These are reviewed by people that have no content knowledge expertise in the sort of research you do. So you get some really weird feedback. So don't get discouraged. You have opportunities to apply again, but it's a really good opportunity to look out for. And I see Leah already dropped it in. So,
and so maybe just building off what Justin said, maybe that will inform you about the style of writing or the target audience of your NSF application. Maybe not make it as technical as you would in a conference paper or trying to publish, but try to target, all 3 reviewers who may or may not even be that familiar with your field, not much less subfield, right?
I think I was just going to say the Goldwater is a really good example, and many of you have already experienced that, of trying to pitch your research and pitch what you do to a very wide audience.
And I just want to this was one question I had before I applied for NSF, which is if most PhDs are funded, why am I trying so hard to get a fellowship of funding anyways, for at least when I was a sophomore? This is the question I had in mind. And as a graduate student now, I can tell you that sometimes having the flexibility of the guaranteed funding is, if at the very least, a nice peace of mind, but it does give you a bit more options in terms of which research groups you want to join, which sorts of projects having that a bit more independence in choosing a project changes the dynamic between you and your PhD advisor a little bit. So if that is a concern for you in graduate school, then that's yet another reason to get funding, even though technically you should be funded for a STEM PhD anyway.
So I think one thing I might add here is that some fellowships offer experiences as well as funding. So I applied for one that gave me very advanced training in software engineering. And I had a great mentor. He gave me career advice. He put me a great letter of recommendation. So the benefits go beyond just the funding.
Yeah, so I think for me too, my program is fully funded. And the program itself is funded for the first 2 years, but after that, my PI or my research advisor would have to fund me fully. That's usually, I think, how schools work. But so I guess it's a little bit easier on the research advisor if you do have a fellowship, especially if if there's more people in the lab and stuff like that. So as Teddy said, it does give you more flexibility if you do have funding, and it's something that you could also apply. And there's a lot of them you can apply to when you're actually in grad school.
I think for some fellowship, but you can also apply that during like PhD year. Yeah, I think it's also good if we can give that information for student or for several fellowship, and student can have it in mind later on if they. And I think it's also a good way to writing grant, because I think that for after for PhD, and then you also need to apply for grant, so it's also a good way to writing to practice and also get feedback from others to see that how we can what approach and how we should approach to obtain the funding in general. And I think that because I think that for students sometimes they for you guys before when you guys apply, what question did you have in detail, and what kind of information that you guys wish that you guys will know before during that time preparing for the application and choosing program?
I can take this one. No one wants. I think for me, which might be different from most people's experience, the hardest part was actually just choosing the schools to apply to. At least the way I wrote it, my personal statement was fairly modular in that the section where I describe myself, not gonna change that much from department to department, but I was having a hard time trying to drill down which specific departments would be a good fit for me, because if you really want to optimize this, you need to go through different schools' website, look at maybe they have different departments that might touch your research. So for me, it's electrical engineering, physics, applied physics, material science. They're all sort of related to my research. I have to look through all these department websites, look through the professors' research interests, filter out the ones that haven't updated their websites in 6 years, and the ones who, have changed research direction drastically in the past few years. So all of that was a lot of free work that, for me, took longer than the actual writing the personal statement. So if one advice I have is, if you really want to optimize which schools you're applying for, and this is not that necessary, but if you wanted to, I would start earlier with even school candidate selection, because it's not like undergrad where you're just applying, not even to a major, just applying to a school and talking everything about you. For grad school, right, you should come in with a clear idea of generally what things you want to do, and they want to see that in your application. So it's important to find out if the thing you're applying to actually matches your interests.
I'll stop saying this after this one about things being field specific. You can just assume everything we say, there could be field specificity. But in generalities, often when you're applying to grad school, and again, this is something you may not be thinking about if you're not familiar with graduate programs and PhD programs, very often you're not applying to a school or thinking about the school you're applying to. You're really applying often to work with specific people or with a specific set of people. And so when you're starting to think about graduate schools, it's less about, I'd love to go to Michigan or Kentucky or Kansas or Hopkins or Harvard or Princeton or wherever it might be. You're often thinking about, I'd love to work with Bill Stoops or Craig Brush or Josh Lyle or Jennifer Havens or whoever it might be that within your field, those are the people that do the research you like to do. And that can be difficult to figure out because you might not know these people. You very likely don't know these people, but you can start to think about ways of identifying those sorts of people. The easiest one, hopefully, is if you have, well, the path of least resistance, that's the easiest way. If you have it, is if your mentor or who you've done research with during undergrad or through a gap year, if they do something remotely close to what you do, talk to them and talk about, hey, I'm interested in working in this field. Do you have folks you know that might be looking for a graduate student? The next thing you can do, think about the papers you read and who wrote that paper that you really like, who was the corresponding author or the first author on it. And that can be a great way to identify folks that do the research within the field that you're interested in. You can also, of course, look on a website within departments and think about, well, this person does really interesting research. This came up earlier about reaching out to potential mentors. I know there is conflicting advice about that, about whether you should reach out or should not reach out to people you're potentially interested in working with. My general advice, and again, don't take this as the gospel truth because it may vary field to field, I think that's a good thing. It gets you on the radar of the person you're potentially applying to. No, not hearing from them is not a bad thing. Hearing back from them that they're not taking graduate students is a great thing because it tells you that you don't need to waste your money and time applying to that program. And hearing back about them in a positive way and initial repertoire can be really good. So important to keep in mind when you think about programs, you're thinking about the people to work with very often, and it's going to vary field to field, but very often it's the people you're working with that you're trying to identify.
Maybe just to add to it and reinforce that. So I think both Justin and Teddy brought a good points. One is that many PIs do not have up-to-date websites. So I would say do not rely upon that to decide which PI to work with. I think it's better to ask people who you know, people in your undergraduate institution for their advice. And I think when in the process of applying, I also met people who were more than happy to give me advice about other schools. So if you can find people like that, then you can ask them for their advice. And I think in general, people are quite happy to offer advice and help. So when you find that, I would say definitely take advantage of that when you can.
And I dropped a link, so I will, to everyone's credit that has not updated the websites. It's very hard now being in the role of having to update a website. If you don't own your own website, it's really hard to update the university's website. I have pity on the folks that they have the faculty photo of themselves from 20 years ago. It's like Fort Knox to get in there. But one way, and this is a very NIH centric piece of advice, and I suspect there's a similar way for NSF funded researchers, but a good way to figure out the research that someone is doing currently is using NIH Reporter. So this is a repository that has all the current grant funding that a researcher has from NIH. It can be as the lead investigator. It can be a good way to see the research that they're doing now rather than the research that they were publishing on that they really did 5, 6, 7 years ago. And that's in the chat. You can also find it very easily by simple Googling Reporter NIH.
And there is an analogous thing for NSF. I think it's called Award Simple Search. Yeah, this process can be very simple. If you know of somebody who does work that you like, and you just send them an email and they're interested, they can help you get admitted, and that's it. So this, you know, on one extreme, this can be a very simple process, and it's even better if, you know, you look them up and, you know, they've just been given a bunch of money to do work that you're interested in, because then they'll be wanting students to support and mentor.
Maybe just to add one more thing though, just speaking from my own experience, I would say do not attend a school that only has one PI that you're interested in. If there's a chance it won't work out for any number of reasons, make sure there are other PIs there who you can see yourself working with.
Great point. I actually, when I was in orientation for my department, they told me straight up, when they were admitting people, they want to make sure there's at least 2 PIs who will be compatible with the applicant, or they just won't admit the applicant no matter how like qualified they really are, because they just have too many bad experiences with also any sort of conflict coming up, and then, you know, you make it a bad experience for everyone involved, right?
And also on the more optimistic end, people move a lot. So that person may be moving within a year of you getting there, and maybe you'll uproot yourself and move with them, but it's probably too early at that point that you're not necessarily going to move your institution. So that's a very important piece of advice.
Yeah, and it's not just about what you think of when you're picking places to apply to. It's also about what you write when you apply to them. So you want to highlight, you know, research interests which intersect at least 2 faculty members' interests, and you can even mention them by name. And some schools will ask you to list out the names of PIs, and you know, in some instances, those PIs, even if they're not on the admissions committee, will be reached out to, and they'll say, "Hey, what do you think of this applicant? Would you, you know, advise them if we admitted them?" And if you only list one person and they say, "Well, they look great, but I'm not taking students right now." I've been on an admissions committee where someone who was great was not admitted for that reason. They listed one person. The person was not taking students, thought they were great, but they didn't get admitted for that reason.
And I think like some students also want to add, because like if they like for example, if they're interested in biology in general, but like they do not know that, or like with like stuff that, or like for example, if they interested in like molecular biology more, or immunology more, or if they want to like so like and also like if they want to like apply in a role that they do not have like the research that they did before, like different, like what is the approach that they should use to like for the application process?
Yeah, I think I can answer this one because I was in a kind of similar situation. So I've been doing a lot of cancer research in my undergrad, and but I'm currently in an immunology program. And actually the summer before I applied, I actually did a summer research in an immunology lab, and I'm just like, oh, this is really cool. So I decided to apply to a PhD program, but I was really not sure whether I should apply to a cancer biology program or more immunology program. And I think what really helped was I talked to people in the field. So in my case, I guess my PI, who was an immunologist, oh, I really like the research we're doing here. So, but she was studying cancer immunology. Should I apply to cancer biology program or immunology program? And she gave me advice of what she thought was the best kind of fit for me. So I guess really asking people, especially those who have kind of experience in the field, or there's also options of these days, there's a lot of umbrella programs. So it's not very specifically like immunology or like virology or something, but it's like more like umbrella of like biochemistry, molecular biology, cell biology, developmental biology, like this whole umbrella biology kind of program that they have. And you could also like if you get into one of those kind of program, you can like explore different labs and kind of find your fit during that kind of process. So so that's another option that a lot of people have taken. So yeah.
Maybe I would also add here that many programs are willing to let you choose a PI that's not in your department. There are mechanisms for doing that. It's usually pretty easy. So that's an option too.
Oh yeah. When I went to a conference when I talked with a program with a representative. They also said that, or like if you want to, for example, you do not have much experience with the maybe data science, but you want to like have that skill like and develop that skill like during PhD program, and then like you can apply for umbrella PhD program, and then like when you join into a lab that lab under that program, but also under other program, and if they agree to like accept you into that lab, and then you also can have like can involve in the project and develop the skill that you want to develop or want to learn more about it. Yeah. I want for the I wonder like because I think that a lot of students also want to know about like when did you guys know that you guys want to like go to industry or want to like have a career in academia? Could you guys share?
And I might not be the most qualified person on this panel to answer this, but this is probably the question that's very recent in my mind. So I'll share how I thought about this. When I was doing undergrad, like starting freshman year, like I was asking myself if I wanted to go to graduate school or not. And I was thought to myself, what are the alternatives and the opportunity costs, right? For me, in my field, like it's fairly easy to do R&D in industry, even, and that's what most PhDs actually end up being. So seeing that as my final end career goal, whether it's R&D in industry or academia, I started asking around, whether it's during my internship, whether it's like upperclassmen or whatever. I asked them, hey, what can I do R&D without doing a PhD or at least a master's? And I always get the same answer, which is you can still do well even without a PhD. And that's when I know you need a PhD to actually do R&D in that field, just the way they were phrasing it. So I think what I would say is you should ask yourself like what the alternatives are and what the final goal actually is. You should never go to grad school for the sake of going to graduate school. You should have some other driving reason and say, okay, I need to go to grad school to accomplish that. But I'm sure people who have more experiences can talk about how they thought about this problem.
I see my opening for I was optimistic a few minutes ago. Now I can be pessimistic. So I think an important conversation to have every time you talk about grad school, particularly PhD programs, is not going to a PhD program because it's the easy thing to do and you like school. And I think everyone here that's done a PhD probably falls into that bucket, but there are a lot of things to think about when you are applying to grad school. Stipends were brought up. You don't make a lot of money during grad school. You actually make very, 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 very little money. And depending on where you're living, it's nowhere near what you need for the cost of living. You spend at least 5, typically, if not 6 or 7 years in grad school, depending on the program. And as you're going through that, you are depending on how well you can balance your life, you're either staying like you're an undergrad or you're kind of stagnant in your life trajectory of the things going on because you're really busy. And many of the people you know will be off advancing in life and doing the things that you think of when you typically think of kind of typical trajectories in life. It's a great time, but it's also a very frustrating time. It's a lot of long hours. It's a lot of erratic hours. It's a very volatile future that involves very low numbers of academic jobs out there. Industry, which has perhaps, and I can't speak to this because I'm not industry, more jobs, but the same amount of volatility when it comes to jobs opening and closing and shifting around jobs. And so if you're going to grad school, it should be because you really want to do the thing that is the end goal of grad school, and not because it's the natural next step. And so Teddy brought this up of thinking about, what do I want to do, and do I need a PhD to do that? And I won't say more than often than not, it's the case that you don't, but in many cases, you don't need a PhD to do the thing that you want to do. So think very hard and seriously about what you want out of the next thing before committing to that time, because it is a serious commitment. In terms of the academia versus industry, I think you should never pigeonhole yourself to one or the other. I'm constantly thinking about when I'm going to get off this burning train of academia to hop onto the industry track, which will probably be never, but you should always never decline the job you don't have, and never kind of pigeonhole yourself in one direction or the other. Both of them have great opportunities for you. And frankly, with how the world of academic jobs and the world of industry jobs exists, leaving as many options as open as possible is important. Jake, I know you've had a lot of industry experience. I forget, Sam, I think you mentioned you might as well. So I think you could probably speak better to the kind of industry academia push-pull.
Certainly easier in a field where there's sort of a revolving door between industry and academia. If you're in computer science, it's hardly a decision. I mean, like half the Berkeley CS faculty are simultaneously in academia and working on their own industrial ventures. But yeah, if you're just interested in doing high quality research that you're proud of, you know, maybe you can find that in industry or in academia. Yeah.
I think this came up in I forget, in the chat about having an experience in a biotech firm. And maybe this is me speaking from not having had that experience, but I think the diversity you can have in experiences before applying to grad school is important and valuable and good, because one, it gives you a more well-rounded experience of when you apply to programs, you have a more diverse background of things you've done. Of course, recognizing you want to commit to something for enough time that it looks like you're not just jumping from thing month to month. It also gives you a chance to see, to my point of knowing what you want to do, of having the experience in place of doing things before committing this long-term commitment to something that is a serious and important commitment that you're making.
So I don't have experience here, but so somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But I do think that if you're interested in doing theoretical science or computational science, it's hard to do that in industry without a PhD. That's my sense. For math, maybe it's different. But for like theoretical physics, theoretical chemistry, computational biology, I think you need a PhD for those.
And I think that like a lot of students also like wonder that like because some they feel that they don't know like how to prepare for, like if they prepare themselves for the PhD program. So they wonder like, oh, like did you guys feel that you guys ready for the PhD program when you guys apply? And what did you guys do like during undergrad to prepare to like have more experience to like develop skill that needed for the PhD program?
Besides research, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I answered this in the chat, but I can reiterate some of the main points there. I think for undergrad, in terms of besides classes and research, I wanted to ask myself, like, what is worth my time doing? Like, what are things that are important to me? For me, that's, you know, things like STEM outreach or planning research-based events, research networking events or presentation, as well as anything that sort of helps build a bridge between industry and academia. And, you know, that's like the nice way to say it, but part of it's also because I want to explore like what the connection is between industry and academia. I want to understand like where's the disconnect and where can we actually have some synergy involved. So maybe think about what is important for you, not just on like a ethical level, but also what you want to do and what you've learned. And then I think you'll find that when you're writing your application, if you thought through like what you want to get out of undergrad, these things will naturally flow into your application, and you don't have to come up with some sort of construed explanation of like, oh, I just want to be a great leader, but like, is that really why you want to do something just to have it said in your application? That's not going to look very good, right?
I think I'll just second in a way this is what was said. Do the things that you actually like doing, because it's really obvious when you talk to someone and you talk about their experiences and it's something that they did because they thought it looked good on a resume versus it's something that they actually cared about. And whether it actually looks good on the resume or not, if they're passionate about it, that carries a lot of weight. So find time for the things that you find that spark joy, that are the things that you care about, that are the things that you are passionate about, the things that you think have an impact, whether they're actually impactful from an outward perspective or not. It comes across when you talk about it, and you may not realize it, but it definitely does. I think the flip side, so that's, I think, thinking about, and this came up in the chat about what can I do to make myself a more competitive applicant. I think one of the other aspects of that question is what can I do to best prepare myself to be a good PhD student, to prepare myself for graduate school. It is a strange transition depending on the program. You shift from having classes all day and filling in stuff throughout the day to having either a minimal number or maybe even no classes, or a couple of classes the first couple of years of grad school and then no classes after that. So there's a lot of unstructured time, figuring out how you work best, how to work in that unstructured time, how to self-motivate yourself, how to problem solve on your own. Of course, you have a mentor, and hopefully they're an attentive mentor and a mentor that works isn't compatible with your style. But beyond that, there's a lot of time for you to just do graduate school and what that means and figuring out what that means. And that can be difficult early on, but I'm sure all of you got a Goldwater for a reason. You're motivated and self-starting and self-motivated, but figuring out how to best do that and balance that in your life and balance out all the other things, because work never ends and you can work all day and work all night, but figuring out how to self-motivate yourself in unstructured time around other life things is really important.
I think there's been a few mentions of any personal statement advice in the chat. So maybe anyone here want to give their wisdom as both an applicant and a reviewer?
So I'll say that I thought it was going to be really important, and I spent a lot of time on it and I worried a lot about it. But when I was eventually on the other side and on admissions committee, it mattered very. I'll just say in this particular instance, it didn't matter a whole lot. It was, what the letters and then research experiences were much more important than what the personal statement contained. And I think in some instances, the personal statement it was usually neutral. It didn't add or subtract anything. But when it did add something, it usually added a sense of maturity and drive from the person who is applying. And when I say maturity, I mean that they talked about their research interests in a mature way, in a way that wasn't superficial. You could tell that they actually understood some of the core issues motivating that area of research. And drive in the sense that it gave you the sense that they really cared about that research, and that they would be able to motivate themselves through what can be a really challenging program. Yeah. Don't sweat it too much. It's probably not going to make that big of a difference. Just
I'll echo almost exactly the advice I often give for personal statements, and I know some separate personal statement from cover letter, but in general, one, make it boring. Don't go over the top and making it this eloquently written opus. One, it takes a lot of time, and two, I know all of us think we're good writers. Very few of us are as good writers as we think we are, and so it make it really direct, make it really just, I'm really passionate about this because of this. Here's what I've done. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I want to do at your program. It may very 5-paragraph essay, boring, but direct and easy to read, because you have to remember people are reading tens, if not hundreds of these. And so they're really not reading them, they're skimming them. And so make it skim proof, make it easy to read. I often describe it as a roadmap to your CV. So just this almost narrative form of your CV. I've done this, and here's the experience, and here's what it was, and here's how I explain what this was on my CV. And I walk through this, and I'm excited for this program because of this. I'd agree often, and I haven't sat on too many graduate application committees, but very seldom does the personal statement come up, except for bad things. People saying weird or silly things, or just it's clear that they didn't actually do the things they said they did, or they don't know how to talk about it, or things of that nature. So I wouldn't sweat it too much. I'd agree with that advice. I'll just quickly, the question came up about doing things I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about this. Doing things outside of STEM related extracurricular things, do it. It's important. If it's important to you, do it. And that's one, it keeps your sanity, and two, it makes your application look like you're a human, and that's really important. So don't give up the things that are the things you love: theater, choir, band, athletics, quiz bowl, video game bowl, whatever it is, just do it. It's fun. Have fun. So I forget, they at least came up with one person, so I'll echo that of keep doing it.
I think students also wonder about the master program. For some of you, like also like you like did master program before PhD program. Do you think that is helpful, and what I think that we can also like have like if students like share about the application process in general. So for some students, if they want to do master program but not PhD, or like do master program to prepare for the PhD program.
I wonder what the other panelists have heard, but the refrain that I hear about this is that if your goal is to do a PhD program, then you should not apply to a master's program. You should apply to a PhD program. If you're not sure and you'd like to do a master's program first, fine. But if you already know that you want to do a PhD program, because doing a master's program is no guarantee that you'll be admitted subsequently to a PhD program. And in my experience, people who've done master's degrees are maybe held to a slightly higher standard during the application process, because people want to see that you really made a lot of your time in that program. So yeah, I wonder what the other panelists think.
Zach, can you share more about your experience?
Sure. So, well, first, I agree with everything that Jake just said. I think if you know you want to do a PhD, then apply for a PhD. If you have an opportunity like British fellowship to do a master's, that's fine. It's a good experience, but it's a detour from the PhD. So many people do masters in like related fields like math or computer science, which can be helpful sometimes, but more for like your own interest or education than for just getting into a PhD program.
Yeah, I agree with all that. One thing to keep in mind with master's programs is very seldom are they funded. So you are often paying for a master's program. And so that's important to keep in mind. One thing you may have noticed is a lot of people have masters that have PhDs. That's not very unlikely. It's unlikely that they got a master's independent of their PhDs. A lot of PhD programs have a interim master's that you do 2-3 years in. It functions as a stepping stone in your PhD, but also an opportunity for folks that don't want to progress in the PhD to leave with a master's and more or less have something to show for the time that they put into their program. So don't think you have to do a master's in order to get into a PhD program. Now, there are instances where if you are completely unsure and you don't want to do a post-bac, you want a more formal post-baccalaureate, so a research tech or something like that position, it can be a good opportunity to have that more crystallized formal master's training program. There are some, so I will say in clinical psychology, there are a lot of folks that do masters because it is so hyper competitive to get into those programs, into the PhD programs. And so a lot of folks will do masters as a legitimate, in the sense that I do think it does help, a legitimate step towards getting into a program. So do think about your field and talk to mentors, talk to people you know. But I will agree with everyone. If you want to do a PhD, try to apply to PhDs and do post-bac programs is honestly my recommendation, rather than just applying to a master's program because you're not sure what else to do if you don't get into a PhD program.
I also wanted to add that I think this is a recent development, but in certain departmental applications, they started adding a checkbox where it says, like, if I don't have funding, I would still like to be considered for admission, or if I don't get in as a PhD, I'll still want to be considered for only a master's. I personally have mixed feelings on whether or not you should check that box, because the fact that they put it there is suspect to begin with, right? But I've also heard that there are certain programs that sort of dangle the carrot of, oh, this master's will turn into a PhD. But if you read the fine print, it's actually never guaranteed or even suggested that, or even you don't even get preference for turning from a master's to a PhD at the same program. So I'll be very careful when you read like a checkbox like that in your application.
Now, if master's is an end goal, there's a lot of jobs you can do that a master's is all you need. Go for it. Don't waste your time with a PhD. Make a lot of money by just doing a master's and then going and doing a job that you make tenfold more than you do in grad school.
I also I think that a lot audience are also like applying right now, and they also like I think that they also wonder about like the interview process and want to learn more about what is the approach that we should use to like when it's come to like, in terms of like interview process. Yeah.
So this past, I guess this year I had interviews, and it was a little different because it was during the COVID times and mine were all through Zoom, which was interesting. And I guess for grad school, they don't really call it like, I guess it is interviews, but they call it more like recruitment week. They are interviewing you, but you're also interviewing them to see if you're the right fit for the program. So it is not as, I guess, really nerve-wracking. It is very nerve-wracking, but it is not as high. You shouldn't be as nervous about kind of the interviewing process, because if they chose you for interviewing, they really like you. So this is also your chance to get to know the program to find the right fit. So I guess some tips, I guess I just had like general, like practicing kind of like the general interview questions, and definitely know your research. A lot of the PIs you talk to, it's usually through one-on-one talking with the PI. And yeah, and they oftentimes ask you about your research, and know kind of like the big scope and like the big picture of what you did, why you did the experiment or the project was about. And they often ask me about like why this school type of questions. And those were like kind of general questions. There are once in a while some people who kind of drill for more like mechanistic questions. There was some kind of unexpected questions I did get, but it's very rare. I guess most of the time, I think it's just more like a casual conversation with the PIs I had. So, and a lot of times, not only interviews, so it's like recruitment week. So they're trying to like kind of sell their program to you as well. So, well, the programs I went to, they did a little bit of like get to know each other, you know, have a little games, fun times. Or like even some people, like they have like a band in Harvard or something like that. So they actually sang to us, which is kind of nice. It was very nerdy, but it was nice. So I think it's not as like once you got an interview, I would say congrats. I think it's very big step forward to getting accepted into the program. So I think it's not too scary, hopefully. But I would prepare in advance and try to look the most, they're trying to weed out like people who's a little bit more, like be a nice person, I would say. Be a nice person, don't say anything a bit too out of the norm and stuff like that. And yeah, so that they're just trying to see the type of people you are on the paper is the same kind of person you are in person. So yeah, it's yeah, you guys will do great.
I agree with if not most, if not all. The interview is the time for you to interview them. It's going to vary program to program. Some are going to be essentially everyone that's come on the interview, they plan to accept, barring things going weird in the interview. Some it's a more of an interview, but they still will take 60, 70% of people, 50, 60, 70% of people. So treat it like you're interviewing them. It's your chance to see the program, see the mentors, see the people there. A few things to highlight. So one is something you don't really realize until you're a few years through your PhD, but the interview is a really unique time and opportunity to chat one-on-one with all these people that you're interviewing with that weekend. You often have these 4 or 5, maybe 6 one-on-one interviews with the faculty members at the institution you're applying to. It's a chance to have this 30-minute one-on-one conversation with them that may lead to your future job, may lead to future collaboration when you see them at a conference, hopefully a few years down the line. Depending on that conversation and the type of person they are, they may or may not remember you, and that may be a way, or you may jog their memory and they're like, oh yeah, it's great to see you again. So take advantage of that. It's a really unique opportunity. Please read what they do. People are vain and they love when you know what they do. So just read a little bit about what they do, have a vague idea. My personal recommendation is pull the most recent couple of papers they wrote. Even if you don't read them, just skim through them and get a sense of the sort of research that they do. People love hearing about themselves, and they love that people know what they do, and it will go over well. And it also makes for a better conversation because you know what they do. The interview is a really good opportunity to see what the grad students are like there. So I was recently asked, and this was for everything, but what's more important, the research you do, the mentor you have, or the people you work with? And all 3 of those are really important. You probably rank them. I probably rank them different than someone else on this call who ranks them different from someone else. But you'll get a sense of all 3 of those things on that interview. The people you work with will be the people in the lab that are grad students and postdocs, and you get a good idea of who they are, what they like, what they think, often one-on-one outside of the graduate weekend and at dinner or out later, what they think of the program, and they'll be often pretty candid. You get a sense of the mentor and their mentorship styles and who they are, at least on an interview, and that can be telling. And then of course the research that you do. The last thing I'll say is, and this was brought up, don't do anything weird. Often the interviews, it's your chance to interview. If you don't do anything like super weird, you're probably pretty good. The horror story that was always told, Kentucky, was about the person who they came on the interview, they were going to get the position, but they were staying with one of the, so often you'll stay with a current graduate student. They'll pair you up. It's a good chance to meet those people and chat with them one-on-one. They stole some of their clothes, which is the weirdest possible thing to do, but is definitely going to not get you an admission to that graduate school. That's of course an extreme example, but every part of the interview, just not the interview, is a part of the interview. So be normal. Don't steal people's clothes. Chat normally when you're out. So I think those are the big things. It's fun though. The interviews are the best part. You get to chat with people. You get to talk about your science. You talk about their science. It should be a good time.
And yeah, I think also like student also want to know more about like the reason that you like decided to like do the PhD program. Can you guys share?
Yeah. Before I applied, I saw this like Tolkien-esque series of 4 papers written by this person. They're all solo papers, and it was just an incredible piece of work submitted in 4 parts. And I thought, I have to learn how to write papers like this. And I emailed that person and talked to them, and then went and worked with them. And so, yeah, that's why I wanted to write papers like they did.
I astroplaned out for a second. Is the question how we figured out where we're going or where we went or where you go? The kind of moment, was that more or less? Okay. I am a victim of the incestuous nature of academic science. So the person I worked with in undergrad linked me up with the person that was the first undergraduate student of his, and I went off to do a summer thing with him and found that I loved that. So I went and did grad school with him. So he's both my brother and my father in a weird academic tree. And so to the point of, and how I got into the research field worked in a lab, I was like, this is cool, and just kept doing it. So much less Tolkien-esque, much more, I guess Game of Thrones is probably the good comparison there.
I've sort of mentioned this before, but I want to bring in a different question that was mentioned before in the chat, which is sort of on how do you decide your summer experiences. For me, when I was deciding for grad school, I knew it was an option from like since freshman year. And when I got into it, I knew I enjoyed it. So what I was actively looking for was really different opportunities besides going to grad school. And after I went into industry and do a few internships, I realized I don't have a problem with industry per se, but the sort of roles I want to have even in industry is more research and development based. And just looking at the pedigree of people who are already in those roles, you get a sense of like there is some preparation needed in form of grad school. And that's how I made my decision. So, and obviously I wouldn't have this information if I didn't go and explore non-academic experiences. So again, just reinforcing the idea of go out and look for things while you're in undergrad, because you have much less time in grad school.
I would say I was really hesitant I initially went to my into college thinking I wanted to do an MD, and but I was slowly converted from an MD to a PhD route. So like I initially started, I'm going to be an MD, and then I started research. I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool. So I said, okay, maybe I'll be MD PhD. So I was really thinking of applying to MD PhD until the summer before I applied. So it was really quick decision that I said just do PhD. But what really made me choose PhD over MD PhD was just like how excited I was to do research. I was so excited to go to lab every day. I woke up excited. It's like, oh, I'm going to lab every day. I'll lab today. I'm gonna look at this experiment and whatnot. But I was not as excited to do clinical experiences, I would say. And I really realized that, oh, it might not be the best fit for me. So I guess doing a lot of experience and trying a lot of things out in undergrad is really helpful. And just kind of, I guess I just had to kind of think for a while, like just kind of sit and think what I really wanted to do and what really made me happy. And I realized that was research, and like this aspect of discovery and was really exciting to me. So I decided to, and I also wanted to potentially pursue academics, and that's why I decided to apply to PhD.
My reason is pretty similar to what's been said already. I really enjoyed theoretical chemistry, and I did not think I'd be able to do that if I did not get a PhD. So that was my thought process.
Yeah, I think that we all like also like love for like research, and also like see what we enjoy doing in the future as a career, and want to like develop more skill and to do the thing that we want to do in the future as a career. So that's why like we decided to like want to do PhD to have the training to give us the opportunity to develop in this skill. Yeah, thank you so much, you guys. And then it's really like helpful and talk, and and thank you so much for coming in to like help students to understand more about the application process in general, and auditive.
I forget if my email is elsewhere, but I'm dropping it in the chat.
Oh yeah.
Chat for anyone who needs to reach out.
Oh yeah.
Happy
It's
answering.
super helpful. Yeah.
Maybe at the end you could include people's emails in the recording that you send out later.
Oh yeah. And and I will send the recording later for everyone. Yeah.
Sorry, I think Kate then was asking a specific question here. If you guys have to go, please feel free.
Oh yeah.
Please feel free. But no, I don't think to answer your question whether or not you want a goal that's so specific of I want to work at Y company to do X job, I don't think you should be that specific. Let me clarify what I mean by like thinking I need a PhD. I was fine with roles that were more research and development based in my particular subfield. So what I really want to do was not, I want this particular job. It's the type of work I want to do is very research and development heavy. And the closest roles that match that in industry typically are occupied by people who have PhDs. And that's my line of logic. So I personally would never have said in my application, I'm getting this PhD to prepare for X job at Y company. I would say like my true goal, which was to conduct research at compelling problems in my specific subfield. I don't know if that is the case for you, but that's just how I thought about it.
Yeah, and I brought up a similar statement of like, know what you want to do. You don't need to know that for that. Graduate school doesn't care what you want to do in your future. They do, but they mostly don't. That's for you. That's for you before you make that decision to know what you want to do. They care that you are passionate about the research that you're going to do while being a PhD student, and a good mentor should care about you're passionate about what you're doing towards the future goal of what you want to do. But the graduate school admissions program cares that you'll be a productive graduate student. And that's about it.
And if
At a higher ordinate level, hopefully they care about the other things. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and if maybe you can look
Go
at
ahead,
some
Jake.
people who've graduated from that department recently and see what kind of industry jobs they've taken up if you're interested in that, just to see if people have success leaving that program and going into industry jobs that would interest you, as well as maybe academic positions. But yeah, seconding what Teddy said about focusing, about wanting to do good work and wanting to do good research, and that being the emphasis. Not necessarily, you don't have to say where you're going to do that, just that you want to do that good work.
It seems like a good optimistic and hopeful note to end on.
Awesome. Well, if there are no other questions, maybe we can stop the recording and just chat or leave the Zoom.
Back to looking at the midterm results.
They looking good?
A's for everyone, right? That does